All right, thanks everyone for joining today. We'll go ahead and get rolling. So today's topic is we're going to talk about OpenAir invoicing, some of the tips and tricks we've seen over the years, and a lot of these tips and tricks you may not even be aware of. So hopefully everyone will walk away with something new today. A lot of them are switch driven, so we'll try to point those out as we go through the presentation. Okay, so this is a handful of the bullets that we're going to talk about today. There's actually other topics that are kind of related to these, but we'll too many to list. So we're going to highlight, some of the invoice number options, some of the invoice groups and invoice layout options on OpenAir invoices, and then billing codes. But again, there's a lot of other items we're going to talk through today. These are just a sampling of them. As invoicing has been available in OpenAir since the beginning, it's evolved quite a bit, and there's a lot of old features for folks like myself that have been around a while that are really valuable, but a lot of folks don't know about them. So I'm hoping everyone today will learn something they didn't know that might be able to help them in their business. I'll also call out that while OpenAir invoicing is a really powerful feature, we understand that ultimately a lot of the invoicing gets sent out of your financial system. So a lot of these are really about for sending OpenAir invoices to your direct customers, but a lot of them are also for how you can help get more efficient at creating invoices and the layout of the invoices, which could be used for internal review. So I believe it'll be beneficial for both parties. So let's talk about invoice numbering. A lot of times there's a need for you to call out different invoice numbering to be able to segment those by a region or by a group. So if you've got multiple organizations living in OpenAir and we want to be able to call out which invoices have which numbering convention, that's really helpful in being able to identify invoices. And there's a couple of ways in OpenAir to do that. One is to basically do it at the customer level. So, as you all are aware, customers really have three different attributes associated with them. There's all of the information we store in the demographic. Then there's the contacts that are associated with the customer. But there's a billing information tab as well. And there's a lot of kind of hidden jewels of capabilities that are stored in this billing information. And one of those is the ability to add a prefix. And so if, for example, you wanted to have all of the customers that are aligned with a specific group be able to have a common prefix, so when those invoices are generated, that would be a way to be able to go in and set the invoice prefix on all the customers that are owned by a specific group, and then have those basically be allowed to group those together and report on those easily. And having great visibility into which invoices belong to which group. So setting it at the customer is a really simple, straightforward option. Setting it at the project's a little more complicated, but it also could be very useful. I'll give you an example. We have scenarios where we have multiple groups that share customers, but they own different projects. So you may have a group that owns projects 1 through 3, and you may have a group that owns projects 4 through 6, but they all align with a single customer. So in that scenario, we wouldn't be able to set our invoicing increments at the customer level. We would need to set that at the project level. And so in order to do that, there's a couple of settings that there's a setting and a custom field that would need to be enabled to store a 3-character prefix on the project. And it has to be 3, can't be 2, can't be 4. It has to be 3 characters. And then when you create invoices, you would create invoices like you would without a prefix. So the invoice pre-approval will look like 1, 2, 3, 4. Once the invoice is going through the approval process, you'll be able to go through, and everyone's familiar with the actions that you can take on different records. So with the setting enabled, one of the actions will be to apply the incremented invoice numbering. And what that will do is it will pre-number the invoices based on the project increment and the project setting. So if you had ABC on the project, it was 1, 2, 3. So you would then see ABC-1, 2, 3 on the invoice. And so it's an after-the-fact way to apply the project prefix to the invoice. One note: if you don't have it set up correctly, like in other words, you didn't use 3 characters, you used 2, or you didn't have it at all and you grabbed it and applied, the system will default to ZZZ. So if you do enable this and you do see some ZZZ prefixes that get created, it's because either it was missing or it wasn't set up correctly on the project to use the prefix to realign your invoice numbering system. Talking about invoice layouts, there's a couple of cool features around expenses we'll highlight. One of them being the ability to have an alternative invoice layout for expense charges. I think these days this comes out of the box. It is an internal switch, but I do believe most customers it is defaulted to enabled. It's not something you have to use. It's an option, even if it is enabled. But what it does allow you to do is if you are commingling non-expense items with expense items on the same invoice, as you're identifying the invoice layout, you may have a conflict where you want to be able to see certain details, for example, around hourly charges, but you don't want to see that same detail around expense items, or it's not irrelevant. So in this scenario, you can basically create a separate layout specifically for how you want expenses to show up. And then you can embed that layout inside of your OpenAir invoice. So you can see here in the example, we've got different invoice columns for our regular charges, but then we call out our summary for our expense charges as an additional layout within the layout. And then that behaves the way that you would expect with regards to organizing the invoice. Now, one note, it does not affect purchase items. So if you are doing POs in OpenAir and rebilling those through, those are not part of this layout. So this is strictly for expense reports and billing those back to your customer and showing those on an invoice in their own unique fashion. Another option is you may have lots of different expense items that fall under an expense category. For example, in this example here, we have airfare and car rental and mileage and training, all of those different items. Maybe we don't want to show all of that on an invoice as too much detail. So what you can do with expenses is you can create these expense item groupings. So that's another option on the invoice layout where you can go in and say, okay, bundle all of these items into a transportation group. And then as I display those in my invoice layout, I'm now only showing the details at the summary level. So it's a way to be able to take all of those details that you may need for impacting different GL accounts inside of your financial system, and then rolling those up so that the customer only sees a grouping of those. So again, it could be really handy for making sure everything gets through the approval process easily and is visibly appealing as well. Another feature, this came out back in 2000, I think. And this was something that had been clamored for a long time and finally came out. I just wanted to highlight it here. A couple of things. One is, when you're creating expense reports in OpenAir and you're uploading those receipts, those physical copies of the receipts, if you're doing it at the receipt level, so in other words, each receipt gets a snapshot or a picture or using a mobile app, when you go and invoice those same receipts after they've been run through billing rolls, you can have the invoice layout go out and grab the attachments. So they become part of the invoice as well as part of the expense report. So you don't have to go in and manually upload the attachments the way you used to before this was available. Now it just ports them over and makes them available within the invoice once it's created. And that's, again, a checkbox on the invoice layout to determine if you want to bring those attached links into the invoice. The other newer feature that you can do that is really helpful is, when if you're using the send feature in OpenAir to send email the invoice, before there was no way to send the invoice as an attachment. It was just a link, and then the customer had to click the link, and then they had to click the PDF, and then they had to download it. So it was multiple clicks to be able to actually get to an attachment. If you include this and make sure this is turned on in your account, you can actually check this box, and an attachment will get assigned to the invoice. So, and that attachment will also include, if both of these are checked, it will include the receipts as well. So when the customer gets that email, they will be able to still see attachments in the email. When they click the attachments, they'll have both the invoice attachment as well as the receipt attachments, if there are any. So really nice, slick feature for kind of making a lot of customers push back on the receipt because it was too many clicks. This is one way to get over those any objections in using the OpenAir send feature to deliver those invoices to your customers. Another feature that probably most folks haven't used or don't use is retainers. So basically, think about a retainer as a customer basically gives you a deposit, or they prepay $1. They want to prepay an amount. And so a lot of times the way customers handle prepay is they'll create a prepaid fixed fee billing rule to say prepay this amount, and then they'll send an invoice, and then they'll have $0 billing rules for all the time entered in next months. And then they'll be able to potentially send those $0 invoices to the customer to show what work has been done. But what it doesn't show is how much has been used, what balance of the retainer has been burned. It's because it's showing a $0 invoice. What the retainer allows you to do is actually recreate an invoice. So you create this retainer. Now, retainers are similar to POs and agreements as they are customer level. So if the retainer is created at the customer, any invoice that the customer has, you can choose to apply the retainer to and be able to assign, so you create an invoice for a full amount. You can then draw down the retainer to show that this invoice has been paid, just almost like a payment. But that gives the customer a way to see how much they incurred that month, how much of the retainer was burned down to apply to that month. And so it gives you that balance option. Now, it's a pretty slick way for that, but the challenge is if you get, a lot of customers get retainer at a project level, not at a customer level. So customer may give you a prepayment or a deposit for specific work, but other work they're doing doesn't apply. So in that scenario, another option, again, with retainers is you can enable a setting that allows the retainer to be associated to a PO. So as everyone knows, the customer PO feature, or also an agreement as well, the customer PO/agreement feature is also at a customer level, but the difference being you can associate a PO/agreement to a project and to billing rules. And so once you do that, when you go to create the invoice and you go to, if there's a retainer associated with the PO that was used to create the invoice, you have a retainer to draw down. If the PO was not, or if there is no PO in this scenario, then there's no retainer to apply. So it's a way to control which projects a retainer belongs to be able to derive the application of that retainer down to the invoice to show it is paid. So most of you may be looking in your accounts, or go look in your accounts later and see if you have this feature. I would say probably most do not. It's not, most OpenAir instances are deployed without this enabled. So if you go to Suite Answers, it'll tell you how to get these retainers enabled if you're curious to use them. And one note, if you are a NetSuite customer and a NetSuite ERP and OpenAir, retainers can be especially helpful if you are doing deposits. So if in NetSuite, if you create a deposit in NetSuite, and then as you're creating invoices in OpenAir, sending those over to NetSuite, if you're applying those deposits against those invoices, then what happens is NetSuite will come back into OpenAir and it will actually create a retainer based on the application of the deposit and then pay down the invoice. So if the $10,000 was applied in NetSuite from the deposit, the retainer will be generated for $10,000 and it automatically get applied to that invoice to zero out that invoice. So it's the way that OpenAir and NetSuite interact when you're using deposits in NetSuite and interacting those back with OpenAir. And also retainers is one of the items that commonly, if it's being used, is renamed to some other item. You can call it deposits or deposit applications or something to that effect. Another layout feature that we generally recommend is around renaming terminology. Everyone's familiar with how you can change terminology in OpenAir, where bookings are often renamed as allocations, but also within an invoice, you can rename the terminology for the values on that show in an invoice. So customers maybe, for example, don't like user being showed on an invoice. Instead, they want to see employee or some other terminology. So in this way, you can go into a particular invoice layout and do a terminology override, so that when the invoice is generated, it's more it shows that. Another trick here is if you want to be able to subtotal by one of these values, but you don't want the value, you don't want to see the subtotal, you could actually clear some of these and subtotal by them. And then it kind of shows that way on your invoice. So it's another tricky way to get the invoice layout to show something that it wouldn't normally do by basically coming in here and manipulating the terminology. Another process is for customers that may do business in other countries where they need to have either Spanish or German or French or other terminology on their invoice. And so this, again, is a way to go in and add those foreign language overrides here if you need to be able to get the invoice to those customers. So many options that are valuable for this override option, but want to make sure everyone's aware. And this should automatically be enabled in everyone's account at the layout level. Speaking of layouts, a couple of things. There's some options that you can look at to, suppress terms if you're storing your net 30, net 60, etc. terms inside of the customer record. You can also say, instead of suppress the terms, but show the due date that's calculated from the terms. So that's another option you can do. You can also suppress the project name in the header. So again, these are mostly header formatting options at the top of the invoice. And you may want to suppress the project name if you have multiple projects on a single invoice, which OpenAir will allow you to do. And you may want to clean up your invoice by not showing all the projects with a comma in between them, and you can suppress that. Another trick is you can actually generate and show custom fields from customers and potentially projects on the invoice header. So you could say, a lot of customers will say, put a PO text field on a project, and rather than using the customer PO feature. And so because it's very simple, one project, one PO, and they want to be able to just show the PO, they're not looking to manage the balance of the PO necessarily. So that scenario, you can add that PO field to your invoice header and display that as well. So another really cool way to be able to add more detail to your invoices. Also, there is also a custom header switch. Again, this is an internal switch that allows you to customize the detail that's in the header. And so in this scenario, you can, you have some of the same options, but what you lose is like the ability in the earlier slide where it said suppress the payment terms or show the due date. Instead, you can come in here and customize how you want that, the order in which it shows up. There's some HTML that you would need to put in here to kind of show how to format the fields and so forth. So, but you can do kind of a customized view inside the header. So again, Probably not something most folks would need, but if you did need that more customized than the out of the box, there is an option to do a custom header within invoice layouts. Okay, so the other thing that is also switch driven is on the project creation, when you're creating multiple invoices, there is an option to use a custom header that shows up on your invoice header. Now, there's a few ways to add detail to your invoice. You can add it at the customer level, and it will be static. You can add it at the project level, and it would be static for all the projects, for all the invoices where that project is added. But you can also set this custom header at the invoice creation. So in this case, we're creating multiple invoices. We've got a start and an end date we've set to drive which charges show up. And we have a custom header. And so we have had customers ask for this, where they want to see on the invoice, services rendered for this project for the period of X start date and X end date. And so, you don't want to if you don't want to edit the invoice manually, because the start and end dates obviously change, this might be an option. We've also done some scripting here to pull in those dates as well, if they vary for different projects or different time periods. But if they're constant and they're generally monthly driven, we can use this feature. Again, little known, little probably used feature, but it is out there. And so you could generate multiple invoices, have the same header show up, and pull in those dates and the project name as a custom header feature. So pretty cool little time saver if you are looking to pull that in to your invoice layouts. Speaking of time savers, another feature I feel like is kind of old school for folks like myself that have been working with the product forever is billing code. It's usually probably hidden because no one really knows what it does, but it can be really helpful in the invoicing process. So what it really does is it allows you to add a up to 2-character limit code on a project, and really it's useful if you want to group projects by an invoice cycle. So these are my monthly projects. These are my semi-monthly projects, weekly billing, etc. And so when you go into your invoicing, you say, all right, it's semi-monthly. I want to pick up all my semi-monthly projects that are billing. By using these billing codes, you can you can add these to the pending billing report and use those to generate only the charges for semi-monthly. Or you can use them on the create multiple invoice form. So if all the charges have been generated and you only want to pick up, excuse me, you only want to pick up the semi-monthly ones, then you would add the SM in this example to the create charges action, create invoice action, and it will pick up only those projects where this is set and only the charges where this is set. So billing codes can be really useful, especially if you do have variable invoice cycles where you have some projects that are invoiced in different time frames. So something also to think about. Everyone knows everyone's probably familiar with the ability to create customer POs and or agreements in OpenAir. Some of the benefits there is you can use those to track those PO numbers as well as PO balances. There is an internal switch. If you don't want to show the PO in the invoice header, it by default will show up there. But if you do not want to show it there and maybe you want to show it elsewhere, you can do that. You can also use it in grouping, so you can group on the invoice by PO or by agreement as well. It's also really helpful if you are doing multiple invoice creation and you want to be able to split out, you say, I want to create all my charges, my invoices by PO. And one customer we worked with had a kind of a creative solution. They wanted to be able to create expense invoices and time-based invoices as 2 separate invoice runs, but but using the multiple invoice. And so there's no option to be able to split invoices by charges. So what they did was they dummied up an agreement, used the agreement on the project and on the expense billing rules for a particular project or customer. And then when they said, create all of my invoices by agreement, and then it would split out automatically the time charges on one invoice and the expenses on another without them having to go manage that manually. So a creative way to kind of use the features in OpenAir and be able to achieve your goal of being able to get efficient invoice creation process. Here's what it looks like if you're using the balance feature, where you're creating invoices with a PO and being able to see those balances. So that can be really helpful for determining when a PO is about to expire and being able to get a hold of your customer ahead of time to be able to request those new POs. You'll probably notice also, if you are familiar with the invoicing process, you can split charges on an invoice. So you can go in here and say, take these charges or take this charge and split it, move part of it to leave part of it, move the other part to maybe a non-billable charge stage. So that's kind of an out of the box, generally comes, but if you don't see it there, it is another switch that can be enabled to be able to split charges. It's a way to be able to say, we overbilled for this month, let's split the charge, move it to a charge stage where it either becomes non-billable or we pick it up in a different invoicing run. There's another switch that allows you to basically prorate a charge or a group of charges. So let's say and again, this is not something you'll see without being enabled, but you could go in and grab an invoice and grab charges and say, I'm going to apply a 10% discount to all these charges because we overbilled, and be able to prorate the charge and move the rest into a non-billable state. So again, it's a quick way to be able to apply and make changes to the charges once the invoice has been generated. Another feature I think probably is not very well known, but this allows you to do similar proration, but before it gets to the invoice process. So for example, you sell a customer a recurring $1,000 a month agreement for services, but you start on the 15th of month 1 and you're ending on the 15th of month 2. I'm sorry, of month 12 or 13 rather. In that scenario, you can actually go in and it will automatically prorate the first month and the 13th month based on this feature being enabled. So basically this feature creates fractional charges for incomplete periods. So instead of having to have 3 billing rules, right? One, bill on the 15th, bill this amount, then bill 11 times this amount, then on the 12th month, 13th month, bill this amount. You could have one rule that understands the fractional dates on the start and ends, and it will go ahead and prorate for those periods. One thing to note, it only works when you're using an end date as in the rule. It does not work if you're saying repeat 11 times. So it's kind of the key to that working. So again, something that's out there that customers probably aren't aware of, but it is a feature that is available. Okay, couple of quick things. We talked about automatically including a PDF with the attachments in the send. So again, I mentioned this earlier, when you're sending an invoice, if you check that box, you'll get that automatic PDF. So that's a nice feature to go to your customer. And the other thing is under invoice options, this was something that was thrown out in a release, I think last year, the year before, where you can then invoice, you can set hard code CCs and BCCs to all the invoices. So as you're sending out invoices through OpenAir, if there's someone that wants to be CC'd or BCC'd every time an invoice goes out, you can then add those to the system, and then you don't have to set those every time you create the invoice. They'll get automatically inherited. Also, if you are using OpenAir to send invoices, there's an out-of-the-box kind of text that says, here's a link to our invoice, blah, blah, blah. You may want something more elaborate or more custom to be done. So under invoice email settings, you can customize the text. It will still obviously add the link to the invoice and the attachment if you choose that option. But you can go ahead and set your own language inside of the invoice email settings. And then you can also have that's customer specific. So if you go to the customer and the billing information tab, you can do an optional email body override at a customer level. So maybe you have something specific to a customer that you want to share with them when you send them the invoice. So a couple of different options for overriding the standard language that comes out of an invoice. A couple of other notes here. If you are using OpenAir to send invoices, I'm sure everyone's aware, if you are, this history option. So once the invoice has been sent and when it's been created, it stores every time the invoice has been touched. And so it will show when it was created, it will show when it was submitted for approval, it'll show when it was approved, it'll show when it was sent to the customer. It'll also show when the customer opened the invoice, which can be really handy to say, hey, I didn't get my invoice. Well, but our system shows it, someone opened it, you opened it on, Thursday. So that kind of a neat little way to track that. It also shows up in the status of the invoice, whether it's been sent, received, or opened. And then also OpenAir, it's not your official accounts receivable reporting, but there is an advanced report that you can run that shows aged receivables. And so, it will take the billing terms, it will categorize the invoices. It's not very customizable, but it gets the job done from a services perspective, as long as you're bringing payments back into OpenAir, either through an integration with your financial system or manual application. You can get these nice little visibility as to what is overdue versus what is current. And lastly, we've had a lot of customers request that we like to automate an invoice. Can we automate a reminder to go out to customers that haven't paid their invoices? And so we've built some customizations around an invoice reminder script that sends an email out to customers to remind them of overdue invoices, and we can have those go out and it's completely customizable as how they go, when they go, who gets them. So there's a lot of discussions to be had about exactly what this looks like, but at the end of the day, if you're looking to improve your accounts receivable and be able to automatically send out notifications to your customer, this might be a good option for you. And if you're interested, please contact us. We'd be happy to talk about it. In summary, invoices are a key touch point with your client, whether you're sending them directly from OpenAir or they're being sent to your financial system. Services folks often get questions around the invoice, and being able to have access to those, leverage all the right features to make sure we're delivering accurate invoices is critical. Being able to reduce finances time assembling these invoices. If there's any tips and tricks you learned today that might help that process, I hope that's the case. And having naming conventions, and don't be afraid to use invoice layouts. Invoice layouts can be your friend here, and we encourage making sure those invoice layouts are set up to really help out here. So that's the end of today's presentation. Again, thank you for joining.